Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Today's guest is a former professional footballer, Andy Woodward. Andy was catapulted onto the front covers of the press in 2016 when he disclosed that he'd been sexually abused over several years by the football coach, Barry Bennell. An award-winning book, Position of Trust, and the film Floodlights showed some of his story. He was a founding member of the Offside Trust and supported the setting up of Operation Hydrant. I'm really pleased to have you join us today, Andy. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
Hello there, Andy. Very nice to meet you. Thanks for coming along. So in 2016, you went public about the fact you've been sexually abused by the football coach, Barry Bennell. Why did you decide to do this so publicly and at that particular time?
Yeah, I mean, I've done numerous interviews as it's obviously shown back then, but the initial start of it was my path in life in general, really. I'd been in the police force for 13 years, and I wasn't treated fairly within there. In 2013, Barry Speed took his life, and it had a real impact on my life then. So much so, I was starting to have like a bit of a nervous breakdown over it. And that was like, many yerid of therapy and everything else that had occurred throughout the years. And I'd seen the big bosses there, and they'd promised me that they'd kind of protect me. Lo and behold, I ended up being put on every single sexual case that you can imagine and sat there for 8 hours a day in front of paedophilia. And I felt like the actual organisation weren't protecting me. They were actually doing the opposite. And it sent me down a really downward spiral. And I kind of had a bit of a breakdown, and I was put in a situation with a FLO role and, subsequently engaged in text with a female, and I could feel myself crushing. And this lady made a horrible accusation against me, which was totally unfounded, unreal, untrue, and I felt like the organisation was really sort of taking me down. And during that process, I started to see a therapist through the PFA, and he'd kind of sort of said to me, "This is not a story. This is phenomenal what you've been through." And he said, "What about writing it down?" I wanted to get it down and off my chest, and being in an organisation as in the police, you're unable to speak out, you're unable to speak to someone. And I'd reached out to them, and what did I get in return? It was like I was being crushed by the organisation, and it was like, I want to get it off my chest. And I ended up meeting a guy called James Bentley, who then put me in touch with Danny Taylor. And Danny came to see me, and he was like, "Have you thought about putting this out there in the public domain?" And I was like, whoa, this is something like, how can I do this? And after a long period, he kind of turned around and said, "Well, let's go public," which was, it was kind of a pivotal moment in my life. And I thought, well, it was either going to break me or it was going to do something good for humanity. And I knew that there were so many other people out there. And I think if it hadn't have gone the way it went, I would not be sat here now speaking to you two. It was in my own mind, and on the surface, everybody has always said, "Oh, Andy, you look really well." But on the inside, it was like make or break, really. And obviously what came out.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, that does sound like an enormous transition that you were having to make from one position in your life to another, much more exposed position. And I imagine you didn't quite appreciate what the impact might be. Clearly, your speaking up was colossal on the world of sport, and probably more widespread actually, and probably helped many men open up about their history of abuse. Yeah, moving on, what was it actually like for you, and what kind of support did you get?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the start of it, really, it was kind of like, it was a pivotal moment for me in my life because, no word of a lie, I was really struggling. And I knew with the police as well, I knew what their narrative was. And I knew they were gunning to get rid of me because, something like child abuse in sport or in life in general, it's something that they obviously didn't want to come out in the forefront. But I had to make that decision, and I made it. And breaking that story the night before, I was sat there and I was crying because I thought, if this doesn't go that way, I won't be here anymore. But when I broke it, when you're asking about support, what support did I have? I'll tell you now, it was zero. I was trending above Trump when I got the phone call, and it was like, for journalists now, I know for them it was like the biggest breaking story that hit the world, and it was, it went global. But for me, on my own, I was kind of sat there and I was getting inundated with calls, with texts, with people from all walks of life just hitting me, and I was pleading with the police, I was saying, please help me. In fact, I actually went to the police before I broke the story and spoke to a detective at Macclesfield. And I said to him, this is going to be a big story, I need your help. And you know what? He absolutely laughed in my face and said, goodbye. And, for the weeks that followed, I was pleading with the police, and you mentioned about Operation Hydrant that was set up. But prior to that, I had no support. I was getting inundated and I was like going, well, what do I do? I have to signpost them some way. And it was just all on my back. And I don't know how I survived those few weeks. And I was in tears on the phone to the police. I was in tears on the phone to, Danny Taylor and The Guardian. I was saying, how can I cope with this? Because it's all on my shoulders. So it was really difficult to start with.
I mean, as you're describing it, it was something to do with the quantity, but also the nature of the news as it was presented. Is that something that needs changing? And did you get a different kind of response from The Guardian to the, I don't know, Daily Mail?
I mean, all of them. I mean, I was kind of approached by every single media channel that you can think of, from newspaper journalists, you name it. They were outside the house. They were knocking on the door. They were ringing me up. They were texting me from the BBC. And when I think back, I did that first initial BBC with Victoria Derbyshire, and I did that on my soul myself. And I was put in a green room, and they asked me questions, and Victoria's there, and Louisa Crompton, and I'm put there on live TV. And afterwards, that was great, Andy. We've inundated, and it was off you go. And I think back to it now, and at the time it was just a whirlwind, but there was no support there whatsoever. It was just off you go. And what I'd say, I walked away and my head was spinning with all sorts, but I was just left on my own. And it's it's wrong. It really is wrong. I can say, David, that when it comes down to the journalists in respect of the initial, revealing of what the truth was, the Danny Taylors of this world, Mike Keegan and, all the others, Ben Rumsby, you name it, I know them all, Matt Dickinson, they all were very supportive in terms of where their journalism and the way that they wrote everything was really, really fantastic. But when it comes down to the actual media as such, when it comes down to interviews, I think I did 14 interviews in one day, and that was on TV and also radio, etc. And by the end, I'd done CNN with Amanda Davis, and it was like 10:30 at night. And I'd probably done about 14 interviews throughout the day. When I think back, where was the duty of care? There was none of it. I was just thrown an NDA, sign that, straight on, do this interview, and then move on again. And there was nobody checking on my welfare. I could have run in front of a bus after each interview. You're talking about a subject that is so sensitive, and I was just reliving it and reliving it and reliving it. But I wanted to get the narrative out there, and I wanted to make sure that those in power couldn't shut me down. So it was when it comes down to the TV interviews that I did, they just left me high and dry. I did them all, but it was hard.
We interviewed Tamara Cherry, who is a former journalist in Canada, and the thing that she's really trying to promote now is actually the idea of having a duty of care and trauma-informed journalism, that actually, no matter how sensitively the journalist tells the story, if someone's a victim of serious crime, they're still being left in a very exposed way, which has a potential to also be quite traumatising in itself after the initial traumatic event.
I mean, yeah, and also it's like, we're going back to the very start of things here, and we're talking about that. And, over the months that followed, this woman who had made these allegations against me, all that was in the media, and it was all put on websites, etc., about me, and saying some awful things about that weren't true, and I was told and advised, oh, don't say anything, stay silent. But I wanted to speak up my truths, but I wasn't able to do that. Hence, looking back on that, I wish I had done. I wish I'd have been able to, speak up and say, well, this is the truth. And one day I will do that, both of you. I will reveal the whole truth about what actually happened there. But the impact it had on me personally was massive. When people are saying certain things about me on a personal level that aren't true, that are actual lies, it's so hard. And especially with the magnitude of what it was, it becomes like I was kind of muffled by, and they were telling me, don't say anything. The best way is silence. Well, looking back on that, I should have spoke my truth, and I should have been able to have free speech, and because I had nothing to hide. But it was all like a narrative. I was sent down this road that I was caught up in a massive tangled web of the whole world's media wanting a piece of me. Yet I was unable to actually tell my truths because the BBC had already got hold of me, and they'd already mentioned about a film, and I was kind of sent down a narrative where I wasn't able to speak, and everything was, oh no, don't say anything, Andy. Silence is the best way, because you'll be able to get it out in the future. But that wasn't the case. And it's so frustrating now, and you can't change your past. But when I look back on that, people should be able to have free speech and be able to speak about what is being said about you.
Yeah, it sounds as if you felt increasingly constrained and controlled.
Yes.
Your family's relationship with Barry Bennell was quite complicated, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that significant harm arose to your whole family as a consequence of meeting him?
Yeah, definitely. And, I look back on it, and we've spoke as a family, and, even my poor mother who's still alive, she's even turned around and said it's like, I believe in past generations and things like that. And, there's no coincidence about the fact that in 1971, before I was even born, my mum's sister was called Linda, and she was tragically murdered by a guy called Ronald Bennell. And Ronald Bennell was found. It was a case in the CSI book where it was finding of the ring, and she was 9 months pregnant in Kingsway, Manchester, and was raped as 9 months pregnant and murdered. And, you move forward when I was age 10, and Barry Bennell came into my life. And it was his cousin that murdered my mum's sister, which people can't quite get their head around, as we can't as a family. But it's like as though the family was cursed on us. And, my mum named Linda, my sister, after her sister. And lo and behold, Bennell got hold of her and ended up raping my sister. And the irony of it all, it's like as though the family was cursed against mine.
Gosh, that sounds like a terrible burden for you all to bear.
Yeah, it is. But it's one of those where it's acceptance, and everything that happened as a child and throughout all that, I've accepted it for what it is. My family struggle. My mum still struggles, bless her. She just puts it in boxes, and I think that's a generational thing. I think back in the day that, that was the way of surviving, really. She won't change in her mindset because she's in her 70s now, and I think if you open those boxes at her age, I don't think it will have such a detrimental effect on her well-being. The other parts of the family, it's hard for them to accept it all, But I fully accepted it. And when you do that, that's when I know that you can move forward with historical abuse.
Thank you. So, and how hard was it to speak up about the abuse when you worked in football? What were the kind of pressures that kept you quiet?
Yeah, as we all know, any sport, especially, now women are playing football, and it's in the highlight really of women, but it's both men and women back then, because football was in women as well. And both sexes, I think, because it's a team sport and because it's quite a macho sort of environment, it wasn't something that, you could speak about. You mentioned anything like that and you'd be shut down. And it was going on in all the dressing rooms. I know now, back then there was a lot of this going on within the dressing rooms. Not so much, for say the sexual abuse, which is another story, but just within the environment of football, it was rife. It was all talked about, and it was a hidden secret that people didn't know what was actually being said within the dressing rooms and within the realms of football.
Do you think those who were in authority could have recognised that something was amiss in Bennell's conduct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know now, after all what's happened. I didn't know then, but I know now that I even spoke to somebody who actually went into the FA back in the 90s and 80s, and they had files and files of letters that were sent to the FA by parents exposing this back then. And the words from the FA back then was, what do we do with all these? How do we get rid of them? So it was highlighted all those years ago, but it was hidden away. So they did know what was going on. And they turn around and say, in 2016, oh, we didn't know. Well, they did. And that's a fact.
It's very reminiscent of Jimmy Savile, isn't it? And also the way that priests have been treated by, abusive priests have been treated, sent to America or Australia to go elsewhere and be able to be inflicting damage in other countries. Did Crewe Alexander ever take any responsibility, make any amends to you and the other men who were abused in their care?
The funny thing is, it's not funny. It's really quite sad, because in 2003, behind the scenes as a police officer, and this is how long ago the police knew about my history, because I went to visit Bennell in prison, because I had a lawyer who was representing a friend of mine, Peter Morrison, who'd broken his leg. And they asked me, they basically heard about what had happened to me as a child, and they said that I had a case against Crewe. So I didn't know, and they said, you've got a strong case, and it was a no-win, no-fee, and the barrister was a guy called Charles Feeney, and I took it to court, and I had a 98% success rate with the case until the day of the case, and the judge got changed, and the defence, which was Crewe Alexandra, had 4 barristers to my one, and I got put on a stand and got asked about claiming a CICA form back in the day, and that I hadn't filled it out correctly. And the judge turned around, and lo and behold, it was a different judge on that day, turned around and said, go back to being a police officer, and dismissed the case. And to this day, Charles Feeney and the solicitor, David Johnson, I've spoken to them since I broke the story, and they said to me this was the biggest miscarriage of justice that they've ever incurred in their whole life. And I look back on that in 2003, and something or someone was behind that to make sure that did not go through then, and I lost the case. So I knew when I broke the story that there was nothing I could do in terms of claim. But Crewe Alexandra, me breaking the story and everything, to this day I've never had an apology off them. I know other players that have got compensation because of it. I've never heard off them to say, we're really sorry, Andy, about what happened to you at Crewe. I lost that case there, and that was a miscarriage of justice. I had to go on to carry on being a police officer. I got hauled in and put on a tape recording why I'd been to see Bennell in prison, but I got asked by the barrister to go and see him to see if he'd give a statement. That statement was completely the opposite when it came through. So when you really look back on it, who was behind all this? And why was that case got thrown out, and why was the judge changed on the day? So there's a lot of questions to ask there in terms of Crewe Alexandra. Who was behind? Why was the 3 or 4 barristers there? Why did the judge throw all media out of the court that weren't allowed to actually look at the case? So there's a lot of questions there. So Crewe Alexandra have never to this day apologised to me or in any way, but there's other players that got apologies, there's other players that have got compensation, there's other players that have rewarded from what I did. So no, the answer to the question is no.
Seems really shocking to hear. I don't see how one judge could listen to all the evidence and then another judge make the decision. That seems crazy. I find it quite awful that you were asked as his victim to go and meet with him in prison, and because we get conditioned, people are conditioned by their abuse to adopt a submissive position in relation to those who've abused them or harmed them. So it's quite a hard position to go in on your own, and it's something very, very uncomfortable, but also I think you see this all the time with whistleblowers, that the organisation that they're exposing, rather than, whether it be the NHS, Crewe Alexander, wherever, that rather than hold their hands up and say, I'm sorry, we got it wrong and how can we make amends, the organisations often lie and cover their tracks, which actually causes further harm because it leaves people feeling really angry about the injustice on top of the original harm and trauma that was perpetuated. So I'm sorry that's your experience, and I want to move on to the FA, and I've got a dreadful feeling you're going to say something quite similar in terms of Bennell obviously wasn't only working at Crewe Alexander. Do you feel the FA could have taken more responsibility in addressing the situation or in helping people recover afterwards if they didn't know before?
Yeah, it's funny, when it goes to the FA. They're an institute in their own rights. They're a very powerful institute as well. I've learned that on a massive scale. Going back to, the clubs and Manchester City, let's be honest, when I broke the story and the magnitude of clubs that were implicated in that, it wasn't just Crewe Alexandra, it was Manchester City, a very powerful force now owned by Abu Dhabi. They weren't back then, but they're a very powerful force. You've got Chelsea, you had your Southamptons, you had your Norwich, your Ipswich. It carried on, the Celtic, the Rangers, and I knew that there was a ring of them. And when it came down to, they didn't see me coming on that Guardian post. And when they did, their initial reaction was get Andy in, which they did. And I had, Sky News, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, all outside Wembley. And I was in a daze. I didn't know what was going on back then, but I do know now. The narrative was they knew that this was a global story of truth. And I met Greg Clark and I met Sue Ravenlaw, and their narrative was to put their arms around me, give me a hug, we're here to help. They knew that the press were outside. They promised me that they'd, get me involved in it, etc. So knowing full well that I'd go and do the interviews and say that they are supporting me. Did they support me? No. Did I meet Greg Clark? Yes, I did at the Malmaison. Did Tracy Crouch MP say that Greg Clark was going to give me a job? Yes, she did. Did he give me a job? No, he didn't. He said, what about the other lads? And because I stood up for my morals and ethics, there was no way they were going to give me a role within the FA, because I would have stood up and said, this is wrong. Instead, they gave roles to other players that came out after me, which that's their narrative, and I support them in what the path they've chose. But for me, it was about morals, ethics, and this needed to be stopped. what they were doing. And then they came up with the independent review, and, that they spend a few £1 million like they did on the Liverpool inquiry, the Hillsborough, you've got the post office, you've got the other institutes, and that inquiry wasn't independent, and they asked me to clarify and say that I was happy for whatever they put in there, and I said no, that's wrong. I'm not going in there, and I'm not putting myself to that name. My name is clear, and my conscience is clear. And that independent inquiry wasn't independent. And
what would you have liked to have seen happen, Andy?
well, I mean, first of all, independent. I did that many interviews on the news, and I was going, well, let's hope it is. Let's hope it comes through. And in my gut, I knew that it wasn't going to be, because all within that inquiry, they didn't mention the other clubs that are implicated, Manchester United and Alex Ferguson, and the things went on at that club. They didn't implicate a lot of things that went on at Manchester City, Crewe Alexandra. Their recommendations were the typical, recommendations that you expect from these inquiries. And they might as well have thrown those millions of pounds that they spent, or so they spent. I spent a full day in with them, and I came out dizzy, suicidal, and they just chucked me on a train. Where's the duty of care with that as well? And I know other people that did give interviews on that weren't even mentioned in the inquiry, but were pivotal to it. So it's not right.
Thank you. Yeah, it's sounding, like the familiar story that when we've spoken to people who've given evidence at ICSA inquiry, and feeling like the independent inquiry for child sexual abuse, and feeling like they weren't taken care of during that procedure. The effects of the abuse have been devastating for your life, haven't they? That not only affected your career, but your romantic relationships, your relationships with your family. What steps have you taken to recover your life?
Recover my life? Wow. Well, I mean, when it comes down to the actual child abuse, I was only 29 and I lost my football career because of it. I'd given evidence to the police after them hounding me, and 18 months later I ended up with panic attacks and panic disorder, and I lost about 2.5 stone in weight. I couldn't play football, and then I got back on the pitch, but I was never the same after. But I spent many years of trying to heal, trying to accept, I had therapy, I was on all sort of medications. The impact is phenomenal, and people would recognise this, that when you've suffered any kind of abuse, it doesn't have to be sexual, it's childhood, and it comes from the child within. And I spent many years in relationships. Gosh, I've been married 4 times, I've had 5 children, and the impact that has on you throughout your life basically defines your life. So the acceptance is the first key element of understanding the child in you. And I think that I spent 20 odd years of, there isn't any sort of therapy that I haven't had in those years about my childhood abuse. And I filled the toolbox up with mechanisms on how to survive and also accept it and move forward. Albeit that it was only probably 2016 really breaking that story was the final acceptance of what happened, and I was able to breathe. But since 2016 and the last 8 years, I've been re-traumatized by the events that have happened and the abuse I've suffered, the media, the silencing, the put me down. And I was tired, and it's taken me probably about 5 years of hard work again. And that's been difficult, Naomi, really difficult to be re-traumatized again a second time in my life when I didn't ask for it. All I did was reveal a truth, and I paid a huge consequence because of that.
I think that's something people probably won't have given much thought to in terms of thinking about the impact of that, and how the potential for re-traumatisation as a consequence of speaking up in such a public way. I mean, I've read your book, which is very powerful. It's very moving. One of the themes that your book and also the film, Floodlights film, covered well was how isolating and alienating the experience of sexual abuse is, which has relevance beyond you and beyond sport. And what comes across is how it dislocated you from the sport, from loved ones, and even yourself, perhaps. How easy is it to recover the ability to belong following years of abuse in the way that you experienced?
Yeah, I think it's so true that, Naomi, and many people will resonate with this because it goes deep. It really goes deep. How the ripple effect of an innocent child in all aspects of life and all aspects of abuse. I mentioned before about sexual, physical, mental, emotional, and the ripple effect that has on family members, on partners, on your own children, and that generational thing, the ripple is a life sentence, and that impact is huge. And I've struggled with it, and I know many other people still struggle with it now. And there's so many people as well, Naomi and Dave, that you look at society in our generation and our age groups. And there isn't many people that I haven't come across that haven't suffered in some form, that they're doing what they're doing now, like us speaking now. Why we're speaking about what we're speaking about is because there's not many people that haven't suffered as a child in some form that has defined who we are now. And that is so key to generational thing that we're sat here. I'm 51 and I'm sat here. It's still a life sentence, but I'm kind of with the childhood side of things. I can move on from that, but many can't. Many are stuck in such a dark hole that they can't express themselves. And on the surface, everybody looks great because when we've suffered as a child, we put a mask on and we're able to do that. From learned behaviour that I'm sat here now and I'm traumatised from the last 8 years, but I'm able to still put that face on, still put that front on, because there's many our generation that live in that vortex of life that they put that face on.
Well, I also wonder, having sort of been raised during your teenage years within sport, and I think there's some similarities actually with people who are boarding school educated, that actually to be good at sport to some degree you have to push through and not acknowledge pain, because you have to keep going and have to keep playing. And I wonder in some ways whether that compounds the harm, that maybe people who don't have to push through in quite the same way might find themselves dealing with that earlier, but maybe for some people there is that disconnect happens in such a way that it's reinforced by the industry.
Yeah, definitely, and I think you're so right there about whether it's in public school or Borstal or in especially within sport, because within sport that determination and that desire and that passion to get to that finish line, that's how I got through it. I disengaged what was going on behind closed doors and my passion, and it was two separate entities, because one was my desire and my passion to be a footballer, like is anyone in any sport or within the media or within the music industry or whatever it is, with that desire and that passion you've got a gift with, that you separate it. So it becomes a separate narrative that they run in line together, but you're that focused on determination to do it that there's a consequence for that. And that consequence is what it is. And it runs in parallel with it throughout your life. And even to this day now, I can have this conversation with you both, but I also know running alongside that is the trauma that what I'm talking about now, the last 8 years and what they've all put me through, still runs in line with that. But I can still have that passion and desire to get to that finish line to actually make a difference for the future.
Thank you, Andy. Thinking about this, And of course, you can only speculate. What difference do you think it would have made to you psychologically if Crewe Alexandra, or indeed the FA, had taken more responsibility for what happened to you and all those other boys?
Yeah, I mean, when you really look back on it, 51 now, and I shouldn't be sat here as I am speaking what we're talking about, because we can never change a past, and our path of this lifetime is what it is. And we're sat here having a serious conversation about something that happened all those years ago. And we can talk till we're blue in the face about what ifs and buts and maybes. And we can't change that. We're living now in the present. We're in 2025. However, when you really sort of like strip it down to the core, what is really, really sad about this is that not just in football, but in society, from the government to the institutes, to the FA, to the football clubs, to the sports coaches, to the swimming, to the gymnastics, to the church, to humanity as itself. I'm still alive and I'm still breathing, as you two are. And the people that are watching this and that are still alive and still living, many people are highly medicated. Many people are suffering in the bedrooms. Many people are having dark days. Many people are in prison. Many people are in hospitals. Many people are locked up in mental hospitals right now as we speak. Now, could that have changed? Yes. Who is responsible for this? Those in power. Could that have changed? Yes. Should it have changed? Yes. How many people in humanity are currently underneath the ground right now? I have many friends that couldn't cope with it, that took their lives, that are no longer on this planet. So some responsibility is with those who are responsible for this. Some have passed, the Jimmy Saviles of this world, the Barry Bennells of this world, the Epsteins, you name it. They are responsible for those acts, that they are psychopaths, come whatever they are. But this is humanity. And should it have not happened? Yes. Did people in power have the power to change that? Yes, they did. But it is wrong that there is many people that are no longer on this planet because of those that decided to turn a blind eye to it, to say that it was okay, to encourage that, to be a part of it, that there is many in humanity that are no longer here to live and breathe because of those decisions and because of those people in power that allowed this to happen. We can't change that past, but there is people that are living as I am today, living with that life sentence, as there is those that are struggling, that are watching this, that may see it, may not see it, but we're still alive. And there is a chance now to make a difference as we're seeing the world change now. And I'm sorry to really go deep there, but it's important that people see that I'm a survivor, but I'm also a warrior and I will not give in. And my heart goes out to those people that are in those dark places, that are suffering. And we can make that difference and change to help those that are in those dark places. That is no fault of their own, and their families that are also suffering because a loved one is suffering with mental illness, is suffering with addiction, is suffering because they're in prison because of their issues from a child, path of life that they didn't choose to take. So sorry about waffling on, but
No need to apologise, very powerfully, Andy. So, as you've hinted at already, you're committed to helping organisations take at least some responsibility in the aftermath of the serious wrongdoing we've been talking about. And we can see how this could be important for survivors. Is there any benefit to the organisation as well?
absolutely. I mean, I've said numerous times, I'm an intelligent enough person, I've been in the police. I've got a wide spectrum of understanding and knowledge of everything. And the problem is, though, as you both know, with big institutes and big organisations, they're reluctant to face it full on. And the acceptance of the likes of me that will stand up, that is intelligent enough to see the gaps, to see the problems, to see the issues. It's all well and good having these workshops. I see it on LinkedIn, all these workshops and people going, look at what I'm doing. It's great what we're doing. We're making a difference. Yeah, it's about collaboration. And what I see is, a lot of them posting up pictures of look what we did in our workshops, etc. But you need to really get to the core of, and really get to the core and really get into the nitty gritty and to make a change. You can only do that by the large institutes allowing that truth to come in instead of the narrative that they want and they see fit for purpose. And that's where I kind of find it hard, because it needs a full on, let's hit this straight on. Let's hit it right down the arrow, right down that lane. But unfortunately, at the moment, and I do believe it will change, it has to. But at the moment, it's still the same old, look at what we're doing and, well, do something.
Yeah, we've had quite a lot of conversations with people who've been whistleblowers in other industries, and it does seem like the organisation's got a lot to benefit if they can hold their hands up and take responsibilities. Actually, it allows people to heal and move on, but it allows the organisation to also get some of its own integrity back. Whereas, in denying and suppressing stories, that seems to push them further into the, down the path of wrongdoing. Certainly you can see that in prison when you work with people who hold their hands up and say, yes, this is what I've done, and take full responsibility. You end up having very different feelings about them than when they're denying it, even when they're banterized. It just causes frustration. When people deny they've done anything wrong, it just creates a sense of embittered anger, really. I imagine it's quite similar, with organisations. I think if they can hold their hands up and say, we screwed up here, we've created harm, we've allowed harm to flourish, that it actually allows for something different to emerge from it that's more positive.
Yeah, I mean, also, it's like with myself, when you really delve deep in, you're talking about the prison service as such, these offenders, I'm not saying all, because rehabilitation is a very, it's a difficult sort of arena, but I've spoke to people that have been in prison before, and I've spoke to many, and the fundamental thing when you speak to a lot of them, I'm not saying all, but some of them have gone down the criminal path because of the childhood situation, and they've ended up on the wrong road because of their issues from childhood, whether that's from any type of abuse. And it's just recently, it made me smile. Just recently, I did apply for a role within offender management, and it's funny, I didn't get past. And I question myself, and I shouldn't, because what my true passion is about getting into the realms of the mindset of people and how to rehabilitate them back into society. Because if you get the key elements right and you get to the core of what was the core purpose of why they offended, then you're on the right road to rehabilitation. Because if you get to the core of why they are the way they are, then, and they open up to that, then you're there and thereabouts to rehabilitate that person back into society, where it's a cruel world out there, and they end up going straight back into the same path. And then that reverse psychology is that they go back into the system again, and it's breaking that cycle, which is so sad as well, because not all of them are what we perceive as being in prison. A lot of them have got serious problems, bless them.
So Andy, what advice would you have for anyone who's experienced sexual abuse to help them get their life back on track?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, that. I think the first principle that I always say is the only way you can start on the path And it's a life sentence. It never goes away. You've always got it there. But the first principle is accepting that as an adult, to instead of what our mens rea works, the way our mind works is when you've suffered abuse as a child, it's hard to separate that child mind. And what we tend to think is in the now. So as an adult, we will think back as a child, but in the adult brain. If we can separate that child to adult and really focus on looking around us and thinking the age that we're at, whether it's sexual, physical, mental, emotional abuse, and see that child, because there's plenty of children out there. And I think this is what one of the tools in the box that I was able to accept is when I saw a child at the age of 10 and I had flashbacks, I saw that child for what that child is. When you can do that, you can start accepting that it wasn't your fault. Blame, guilt, and I should have, could have, should have, why didn't I do this, why didn't I do that? The what ifs, it's because we're still thinking as an adult brain. And once we can accept it looking at a child, and I'd advise people, whenever we have a flashback, look at that child and look at that child properly. And then you lose that guilt. And I think that's the key part to learning to accept, because acceptance is the first key to moving to the next step. You can't move until you've got that.
That's really solid advice, and quite often people are taking the adult perspective on their own childhood self, and I think it's good advice to be advising people to look for other children of the same age, because they have a very different perspective if they were to think, did that child deserve this? Did that child invite that? So, Andy, we're coming to the end of time, but I wondered, what does the next stage of your journey involve?
Well, I've kind of, in a synopsis, in the last 8 years, I went from literally globally recognised in every magazine in the world. I was on every blooming documentary, HBO, to you name it, Sky News. I went Change the Law with Brazil, and I've done everything to being completely silenced, to as though I don't exist. I think the last straw, what they did to actually silence me was put me in a mental hospital, which was a great experience, but it was part of you not speaking up anymore. So I spent the last years recovering, healing, doing a lot of work with a number of people, and I've gone on a spiritual path as well, where I've understood an awful lot about life and about the world and about, the energies that we have. And I spoke to Ron Rudin, who did Havening, which is a great format about the brain. I've learned about the brain, I've learned about the heart, I've learned about energy, I've learned about delivering. My gift is public speaking. I know in my passion and my heart, I can inspire others. I want to inspire others. I want to give others the empowerment to see it from my perspective, and that's something that I really definitely want to do. I've got my mojo back, I've got my strength back, and the future, I'm working in collaboration to make a change for humanity now. And I think I've done my fair share of silence. I've done my fair share of delivering something for humanity, a legacy that nobody can ever take from me. And now it's about the future, and now it's about future generations, the children, the youth, the people in society that are struggling, those that are in dark places. Bring them back out and say, no, I'm an example of this, and I can deliver to anyone. I can speak in front of, I got 3 standing ovations at the Sports Journalists Awards in 2017, giving awards to Daniel Taylor. Great, have an award, but this is me. I got 3 standing ovations. That's what my passion is. That's what I want to deliver. That's what I want to help others. I want to inspire others and say, do you know what? This is Andy Woodward. I'm back and I'm ready to speak again.
Great.
Thanks very much indeed, Andy.
Excellent. That's a good wrap up. Thank you.